But before I introduce her, let me give you some background. How did we discover her? It was Marie Hansen, a charter member of our lodge's reading circle, who started the ball rolling. She had read an article in the Viking magazine about the recently dedicated, excuse me, got a frog in my throat. Let me just take some water. Excuse me. That was not good timing. So it was Marie Hansen, a charter member of our lodge's reading circle, who started the ball rolling. She had read an article in the Viking magazine about the recently dedicated memorial to the victims of the witch trials in Finmark. In this article, the historical novel about these witch trials by Kieran Millwood Hargrave was mentioned. Marie suggested that our reading circle read this book. We did read it, and we found it very interesting and, of course, very disturbing. None of us had ever heard about these witch trials in Norway before. Then another member of our reading circle, Lori Jaglet, discovered that the original transcripts from these trials had been translated from Norwegian into English. To make a long story short, we tracked down the translator, and Lori very generously bought the book with these translations and gave it to the lodge. So in our library at Norway House, we have this very valuable book. It is so valuable that it will not leave the library. But anyone is welcome to come to the library to see it. Let me now introduce our speaker. Liv Helene Williamson is Professor Emerita of History, University of Tromsø. This university was established by an act of Parliament in 1968 and opened in 1972. It subsequently merged with several other institutions, including Finmark University College. It is now officially called University of Tromsø, the Arctic University of Norway. It has the distinction of being the northernmost university in the world. Professor Williamson has not one, but 2 doctoral degrees. I find that very impressive. She has a PhD in history from the University of Edinburgh. She also has a PhD in literature from the University of Bergen. Her doctoral thesis in history is entitled 17th Century Witchcraft Trials in Scotland and Northern Norway. Professor Williamson has had an extraordinary academic career. On August 16th, 2019, she was awarded the Norwegian King's Medal of Merit for her extraordinary research on the dissemination of scholarly literature.
Get on with it.
I will now only mention 2 of her works. In 2013, she published the book Witches of the North, Scotland and Finmark. And in March of next year, 2022, another book that is relevant to our discussion today will be published. It is entitled The Voices of Women in Witchcraft Trials, Northern Europe. I hope she will say something about this book today, but let me just say here that it is based on her study of women's voices in trials in 8 countries around the North Sea: the Spanish Netherlands, Northern Germany, Denmark, Scotland, England, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. And then I personally hope that she will come across the Atlantic and write her next book comparing the witch trials in Finnmark with our own infamous trials here in Salem. If she does, I would expect her to include something in this book about my own 3 8th-grade aunts who were accused of being witches back then, and 2 of them were hanged in 1692. And now it gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Williamson. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you very much for these nice words and the introduction, Christine. So I'm now speaking from the city of Tromsø in northern Norway. And Tromsø is situated north of the Arctic Circle, so that from today and until the 21st of January, we do not see the sun at all. It's not above the horizon. And in summertime, we have 2 months with midnight sun. So there are contrasts in this part of Norway. Today, I would like to speak about the witchcraft trials in Finnmark, northern Norway, and Stelnes Memorial. So the witchcraft trials in Finnmark, they took place in the northernmost county in Norway, named Finnmark. And Stelnes Memorial is a memorial to commemorate the victims of the Finmark witchcraft trials. The witchcraft trials dealt with persecution of alleged witches. Women and men were executed in Europe and America, and these trials, they were all criminal trials. So those who were accused of witchcraft were brought before courts in Norway and in all over European countries and also colonial America. And they were tried alongside with violence, murder, theft, and all kinds of serious crimes. So the witchcraft trials were secular trials, and people were accused of breaking the law. In Europe, about 50,000 people were executed during the witchcraft trials. Most of them were burned in fire at the stake, and this is a bit different from the Salem witchcraft trials in 1692. So this crime of witchcraft, what was that? It was the ability some people have of causing supernatural powers to interfere in the life of fellow human beings or animals to detriment of their welfare. So we are talking about invisible forces creating bad luck, sickness, and death. People at this time in the 17th century believed that witchcraft was possible to perform, and that some people had the power to perform witchcraft. So we have to understand that the mentality of the time, the 17th century, was very different from the mentality and the way we have today in understanding the world and our imagination about the world. This was before the period of enlightenment, and people believed it was possible to perform witchcraft. In Europe and colonial America, we have trials, and I think most of you know well about the Salem trials that was at the end of the 17th century. But witchcraft trials in Europe started already around 1450 and ended around 1750. So we are talking about, in historical terms, a period of 300 years when people were accused of performing witchcraft. And after year 1700, there were very, very few witchcraft trials. So most of the trials and the most intensive period took place in Northern Europe in the 17th century. Witchcraft trials mostly were related to women. 80% or about 4/5 of those accused of witchcraft were women. But there were also men, and 20% of those accused of witchcraft were men. So it was not only a crime related to women, but the majority were women. The last witchcraft trial in Europe took place in 1782 in Switzerland. And both Catholic and Protestant areas were involved in this persecution of witches. And in fact, Catholic areas, it started these ideas about this, learned ideas about witchcraft in the Basel Council in the 1430s already. The witchcraft trials are characterized by two concepts of witchcraft. We have the traditional harmful witchcraft, the old art of witchcraft, known in most countries and most areas of the world. It was an individual performance. And then we have this new and learned ideas about witchcraft coming up in the 1400s. The core element in these new and learned ideas about witchcraft was a pact with the devil. And when you entered into this pact with the devil, you got power from him to perform evil deeds. And the other core element was a collective performance of witchcraft. It was not one person who performed witchcraft. It was a collective performance. Here is an illustration of the traditional witchcraft, stealing milk from cows far away. And you can see they have an axe, and this axe is used to get milk from a cow. And in traditional tales, it is said that you could milk the cow bucket after bucket, and at last blood came out and the cow died. This is the tales that go for this type of witchcraft, stealing of milk. And traditional witchcraft was performed in all countries of Europe and in areas outside Europe. It's the old way of thinking about witchcraft. So this traditional harmful witchcraft, it consisted of throwing evil spells over humans and animals. And often we see the situation that first a person in a village or a town becomes angry, and he or she utters some angry words, and then short time afterwards, a tragedy, a sickness, or even death occurs. So that it is possible to make a connection between these evil words, the threat that is uttered, and an accident or tragedy that happens afterwards. So this is the old way of thinking about witchcraft. Then came up in the 1400s and the centuries after this learned European doctrine called demonology. It was a book production in Europe from 1400s and onwards. And in these books, you could read about a pact with the devil, a person turning from God to the devil, renouncing the baptism, witches' gatherings, shape-shifting into animals, birds, and even whales, if you were going to turn over a ship, and also collective witchcraft operations. So that this shape-shifting often had to do with the need to fly through the air to come to a mountain or a field for the witches' meeting. And there are clearly unrealistic elements in this demonologic thought or this doctrine. The devil's pact is often described in a way that the devil is first tempting a woman. She says no. He comes back several times, and the woman is weak and at last gives in. So the woman renounces her baptism and enters into a new pact, and the devil gives promises. The book production related to demonology was large in Europe, and the most well-known book is Malleus Maleficarum, or The Witch's Hammer. It was published in 1486 and translated into several languages, and certainly had an impact upon the witchcraft persecution in Europe. Included in this demonological doctrine is the collective aspects, and this is the aspect that turns out to be fatal in many trials because it leads to linked trials or panics. After a woman has confessed of participation of a witches' gathering, the interrogator always poses the question, who else were present? New persons are denounced and they are drawn into linked trials or panics, lasting from some months to a couple of years. So it's a kind of escalation that goes on because of this witches' meeting where many people were together. The witches' gatherings have attracted the attention of many artists and painters, and this is an illustration from the 17th century of such a witches' gathering. In Norwegian, you can see it's called heksesamling. Samling, that means gathering, and hekse, that is the same as witch. So you can see on this painting, there is a woman accused and they even have a scribe, but there are many elements here that does not occur in an ordinary courtroom. Women were the main group accused in panics. And this relation between the devil and a woman is very strong when you read the documents. There is a clear connection between the devil and a woman, and women are inclined to evil deeds. So we see in these demonological books is a clear contempt of women. It's very clear the woman is weak and she is inclined to do evil. The witchcraft trials could not have taken place without intervention from the state. And at this time in Northern Europe and in the Scandinavian countries, the state was equal to the king. And at this time in Norway, we had a union with Denmark. So there was a union between Norway and Denmark, and the king was in Copenhagen in Denmark. So the ideas from this demonological doctrine enters into the agenda of the state leaders and comes into courts and church. So these ideas from the learned demonological doctrine certainly finds a place in most communities during a short time, and also often transmitted by oral transfer. Also, the laws, the written laws, were affected by the new and learned ideas of witchcraft. Witchcraft cannot be proved by ordinary burden of proof. It was a crimen acceptum. It was a crime that was accepted from ordinary burden of proof. So this we see in the letters of the law. In Norway, there was a decree in 1617 when the true witches were defined as persons who had entered into a pact with the devil or had something to do with the devil. So these new and learned ideas came into the written laws. So in witchcraft trials, they used circumstantial evidence because it was difficult to get another type of evidence. And one of these methods were the water ordeal. The suspected person was thrown into water or into the sea with hand and feet tied together. And if they floated, they were supposed to be guilty because water was considered a sacred element that would repel evil. If they sank, they had a rope around the waist, so then they were dragged into the shore again. So there was a necessity of a personal confession in witchcraft trials, and this is the point where torture enters the picture. The preaching of the church at the time was very much concerned with the devil. The devil was a dangerous and very mighty figure, and it was a fight between God and the devil, a fight about the souls of human beings. In Norway, the Reformation took place in 1537, in Denmark 1536, but both Catholic and Protestant areas of Europe were affected by witchcraft trials. So in Northern Europe, most of the trials came at the end. They started at the end of the 1500s and continued in the 1600s, the whole of the 1600s. But it had started already in Catholic areas in Germany and Switzerland. In Norway, the period of witchcraft trials, it was from 1560 to 1695, so a bit more than 100 years. And about 750 persons were accused, which gave 310 death sentences, mostly sentenced to death in fire at the stake. The average percentage of women in Norway was 80% and 20% men. So this was the same as in most countries of Europe. And the trials comprised both the traditional harmful witchcraft and this learned witchcraft. In Norway, the strongest and most intense witchcraft trials took place in the county of Finnmark, particularly in the eastern part of the county of Finnmark, in the villages of Vardø and Vadsø. And if you can look at this map, just to the left of the circle is Tromsø marked, where I'm sitting now. So I'm not so high up north as the northern tip of Finnmark, but relatively high up north. So we have strong witchcraft trials in Finnmark. And this is what I have been studying for several decades. I started out with my master thesis in started to read these documents in 1980. So I have worked many years with these court records from Finnmark. The sources, the reason why we know that there have been witchcraft trials in Finnmark and also in other parts of Europe and also in Salem is that we have preserved the court records. So in Norway, it is well-preserved documents. They come from the archives of the Finmark district magistrate, and they are preserved in the regional state archives of Tromsø. So it is possible when you go to the archives in Tromsø to get hold of these court records and see the same ink and the same paper and the same words that were written down by the magistrate in the 17th century. Then we have copies of some sentences made in a document made by the regional governor Hans H. Liljenskjold in the late 1600s. These are also valuable to understand the witchcraft trials. And we have the district accounts, which consist of the expenses of the state and also the income of the state, if they had expenses related to the burning of witches, and also if there were something left from those who were burned. We can find this in the district accounts, but they are very, very brief, and they are not very rich sources when it comes to words, the amount of words. Here you can see court records that we call tingbok in Norway from Finnmark. And if you look at the right-hand side at the top, you can see the word aprilis, because it is written in italics. That was italics at this time. It's a Latin word. And the rest of the page is written in the Gothic hand. So the scribe at this time in the 17th century used to write in the Gothic hand. So when I started to read these records several decades back, then I have first to learn the Gothic hand to understand these words. It's very clear, written and beautifully documents, and it is really a pleasure to sit and work with these documents because it brings you back to the same period of time when they were down written. So the Finmark witchcraft trials, there were 3,000 inhabitants in Finnmark around 1600, and 135 persons accused of witchcraft during the century 1600 to the end of 1600. 82% women and 18% men. There was a high rate of execution, 67% or 2/3, and 91 persons were sentenced to execution in Finnmark. Those who were not sentenced to execution, but they could be banished or fined, or in a few cases acquitted. So it was very strict, the persecution in Finnmark, and because of the very low number of inhabitants, Finnmark is brought up to the same level as the most intense areas of Europe when it comes to persecution and execution rate. So the Finmark courts, they were local courts, and they were placed in villages all along the coast. So the local courts, they acted very much on their own because it was a long way to Copenhagen and the central authorities, and the local courts were allowed to pass death sentences. So in some cases in Finnmark, we can see, in fact, that a person is brought before the court one day, and the next day he or she can receive a death sentence. So they worked very efficiently and rapidly. There was another level in the court system, the Court of Appeal. And this Court of Appeal judge came to Finnmark every 3rd year. And traveling north, he went to the same local courts as the usual courtrooms for local court trials. So when he came only every 3rd year, it means that a lot of cases that could be passed on to the Court of Appeal judge had to wait for a long time. And probably this influenced also the intensity of the witchcraft trials. The church in Finnmark, we can see from the documents that ministers took part in pre-trial questioning of the accused and in preparing the convicted before execution. And we have found in Finnmark Danish sermon books from Danish theologians like Niels Hemmingsen, was a professor of theology in Copenhagen, and also Jesper Brockmann. So the thoughts from Copenhagen and from Northern Europe reached up to Finnmark. Here you can see the witchcraft trials during the 17th century in Finnmark. And if you see this variation from very few trials some years and then very, very tall columns some years, this means that the witchcraft panics, where you have denunciations of many people taking part in witches' gatherings, these panics you can see in these very, very tall columns. So there were 3 witchcraft panics in Finnmark during this century. In Finnmark, there was a special ethnic situation. Norwegians and Samis, the Sami people, lived side by side. And they had different culture and they have different language. So the Samis, they were around 1/5 of the population in Finnmark at the time. As for the witchcraft trials, Norwegian women were targeted for the devil's pact. But when it came to the group of men, Sami men were targeted for traditional sorcery and brought into the courtrooms. So particularly the Sami men, they are well known in Europe to be good sorcerers and witches. And this has to do in particular with a book written by the Swede the Swedish author Olaus Magnus, The History of the Nordic People, which were published in Rome in 1555. So you can see here on this illustration that the sorcerers were very strong and had horns and claws, and also they were able to cause wind and very bad weather. So there was an idea in Europe that it could be that very, very strong witches lived in the north. The accused women during the Finmark witchcraft trials were living in the villages of Vardø and Vadsø and the surrounding fishing villages. So we are in the eastern part of Finnmark County. A good deal of those accused were married women living in these villages, almost 70%, and some of them were maids. And many of these maids came traveling north to Finnmark to get work. They came traveling along the coast from southern part of Norway or from the west coast of Norway and wanted to have work in Finnmark. The building very central for the witchcraft trials in Finnmark, that was Vardøhus fortress. It was in Vardø, and this concentration of witchcraft trials in East Finnmark certainly had to do with the district administration at the Vardøhus fortress, where the regional governor was placed. He was the king's man in Finnmark. And if you are able to see this watercolor, it is also made by this district governor, Hans H. Liljenskjold, at the end of the 1600s. It's Vardøhus fortress, or sometimes in the sources it is called Vardøhus castle, Vardøhus slott, and this was the administration center of Finnmark. I'm going to take you into one of the panics that took place in Finnmark from the autumn of 1662 and until April 1663. This figure shows that at least 30 persons were involved in these panics, and the arrows going back and forth shows denunciations. So one person denounced another or several other persons to be witches and having taken part in witches' gatherings. So there was an escalation of cases, and 20 women were executed during these months. So certainly it was a hard strike for Finnmark and for these villages. Only females and even some small girls were accused of witchcraft, but they were acquitted by the Court of Appeal judge. The local court found the cases against the small girls too difficult to judge, and therefore these cases were passed on to the Court of Appeal judge, and he acquitted all these small girls. We go into a courtroom in Finnmark on the 10th of March in 1663 in the village of Vardø. 4 women were brought before the court at Vardøhus fortress. Mighty men in the courtroom, and the regional governor himself was the interrogator. At this time, in March in 1663, intense trials have been going on since October 1662. And many women have been imprisoned at Vardøhus fortress during Christmas. And after the new year, 1663, already 8 women are burned. First of these 4 women entering the courtroom was Margrethe Johnstadter. She lived in Vardø, had been a maid in Tromsø, traveled north, and then she was denounced by 2 imprisoned women. She was brought before the court 3 times previously, but refused all the time to confess to witchcraft. Then she was tried by the water ordeal on 9th March and floated. And the water ordeal, it was considered to be God's judgment. It was a sign from God whether this person was guilty or not guilty. And often a lot of people from the village and the surrounding areas came to see what happened with the person who was tried by the water ordeal. Then Margrethe confessed something dangerous. She said she had learned witchcraft, she had entered into the devil's pact, she had participated in a gathering of witches on Midsummer Eve on the local witch mountain of Domen. It was close outside Vardø. She had participated in chasing fish from the shore, and also she had participated in casting a spell on a boat of a Bergen merchant sailing north. Then the second one was Sigrid Johnstadter. She was brought before the court at Vardøhus fortress the same day. She lived in Vardø and confessed that the evil Satan came to her in the likeness of a dog and wanted her service. And eventually she promised. In return, all her doings would be successful. And this is often the time of promise that's given, that they will have good luck with animals and everything they undertake. Sigrid Johnstadter also confessed she has got a mark from the devil on her little finger's uttermost joint. And she said she had tried her art out on a pig which died, and she had participated in the witches' gathering at the mountain Domen and chased the fish away from the shore with stalks of seaweed. There were several women sitting on the sea. It is a beautiful picture, in fact. And they had seaweed in their hands and they were chasing the fish from the shore, which of course resulted in very bad fisheries that spring. And she had cast witchcraft on the ship of a Bergen merchant. The witch mountain Domen is here in watercolor by Hans H. Liljenskjold, and it is visible even today, visible from Vardø. And the witch's Sabbath, also like the other picture I showed you, is taking place sometimes on a field. And here you can see the evil one in a very often used shape of a goat. The third woman brought before the court on the day in March, she came from the island of Senja. It's a big island a bit along the coast of northern Norway. She refused to know witchcraft and wanted herself to go through the water ordeal. Maybe she had hoped she would not float, but she floated like a bob. She confessed to have learned the art from a woman in Ofoten, which is also to the south, the place she lived before, and that she received the art through a drink of beer. She said that Satan came to her in the likeness of a crow, and she promised to serve her God. She got a personal demon called Morten. And these personal demons, they are a feature of not only Finnmark witchcraft trials, but you see them all over Scandinavia. They help the elite witch to perform witchcraft. So Gundel, she was promised good fortune with livestock and anything she undertook. And in the likeness of a seal, she chased the fish from the shore. And then she had been in the likeness of a crow attending a witches' gathering on this mountain Domen on Midsummer night. And then the wicked Satan, which is called Old Erik, and that is a colloquial expression used even today. Gammel Erik, we say in Norwegian. Old, that means gammel. So he joined them in the likeness of a crow. And this, the names they use for the evil one, that they use Old Erik, or sometimes they use other names. So this is a variation between biblical names or colloquial names they use on the evil one. So common features in the confessions of these three women, they were renouncing the pact of baptism, and they had entered a new pact with the devil, and they had got access to evil power. They participated in witches' gatherings, shape-shifting, and they denounced others. And all the time, this was related to the alliance with the devil. Then came the fourth one, Dorette Paulsdatter. She lived in Vardø and was also born further south on Hamarøy, the Hamar Island. Øy means island. And she refused also to confess to witchcraft, but said that she once had received a drink of beer which made her feel unwell. It's almost like she's searching her mind to find out whether she could have received something evil. She was submitted to the water ordeal at her own request. She had hoped she would not float, but she floated. No judgment was passed, and she disappears from the record. The same day, in the evening, she was tortured to death on the rack, and this we know from other sources, not from the court records. And this is the rack. It was at Vardøhus Castle or fortress, and you find it all over Europe, stretching the limbs. On 11th of March, the day after Dorette was killed, the trials continue as if nothing special had happened. Death sentences are passed on Margrethe Johnstadter, Sigrid Johnstadter, and Gundel Olsdatter. 3-4 days later, the three sentenced women were burned alive at Steilneset, the gallows, tied to a ladder which is toppled onto a burning pyre. And the corpse of Dorette Paulsdatter was dragged out to Steilneset, to the gallows, and burned together with the living women who were sentenced to death. The use of torture at Vardøhus fortress shows the same brutality as in the rest of Europe. What we know from Finnmark is they used the rack, they poured sulfur on the breast of the person who was lying on the rack, they burned with red-hot irons, they fastened the imprisoned person to the walls of the cell with handcuffs and foot chain. In Norway, torture was allowed after that sentence was passed, and then to get names of accomplices. Torture before sentence was passed was not allowed in Norway. Still, it was used in witchcraft trials and in many, many other countries to press forth a confession. So why this torture? The crime of witchcraft could not be proved. The use of circumstantial evidence, like the water ordeal, was not sufficient. Even if they had several methods in Scotland, they used something called witch pricking. They pricked the accused person with a needle, a big needle, to find a spot that was insensitive and did not bleed. But it was not sufficient to pass a death sentence. So therefore, it must be pressed forth by the use of torture. So the confessions that the women gave, it was given after torture, or as we have seen, after the water ordeals, and the interrogators got all the answers they wanted. The accused persons confessed willingly to leading questions, and still afterwards it is entered into the records. The day after they have been tortured, for example, that now they confessed of their own free will, good willingly or voluntary. So you have to read the sources with a suspicious glance. Fear runs through these trials. The accused, the fear during the trial, the people in the local community, fear of denunciation, who will be the next, the judicial officials, fear of dangerous witches, and the men of the church, fear of the devil and what he could carry out through his allies. It is a deterrent system. It was a gruesome sight to see a person burned alive, see and hear and smell. And this is just the effect that was aimed at. Human beings should not be tricked into the snares of the devil. It was necessary with the purification by fire that we see for Dorette Johnstadter, who was dragged out to the gallows after she had been killed. The sentenced persons, they got the Holy Communion before execution. So the idea was that the burning was purifying in the way that could help for afterlife. So why did they confess? It was a wall of mighty men in the courtroom. It was pressure and torture. And what we see when women are imprisoned over time, she is at last so exhausted that she is looking only for her own death as an escape and relief. The confession, what they tell, is an enforced narrative, but they have this knowledge of the ideas of witchcraft by oral transmission from the other parts of Europe, and also brought up first by learned persons. So this enforced narrative that they deliver in the courtroom is often an answer that they might have answered only yes or no, but they give a whole narrative, and also in that way shows that language, in fact, is the last resort. When a person is pressed to the uttermost border, then they cling to language and they still have this ability to narrate. So this is very strong to read the confessions. And this is what has grasped me all the time from I started to work with this material. How could they manage to give a narration of a story in this moment of life? There are clear connections between the local court in Finnmark without control from a higher judicial level and the high number of death sentences. And we see a clear connection in the material between women, torture, the devil's pact, denunciations during interrogation, the linked trials, and high execution rate. So these learned ideas made an impact. For the group of men, we see individual performance of witchcraft and more of the traditional harmful witchcraft. The men very, very rarely take part in witchcraft panics. Then I would like to say a bit about Steilnes Memorial in Vardø. It is part of the national tourist routes in Norway, which is under the state department in Norway. And the aim is to build on several places along the roads in Norway to build places with very high quality of architecture and also some places history. So the Steilnes Memorial is built to commemorate the victims of the Finnmark Witchcraft Trials. And there are two buildings. There's a round glass pavilion and one long and narrow building, 135 meters long. So this project, it had been going on for some years, but in 2006, the national tourist routes came into the project, and when they came into the project, the work went much quicker and much more in professional terms further on. So invited to this project was Peter Zumthor, architect from Switzerland, Louis Bourgeois, French-American artist and sculptor, and me as a historian. So the components of Steilnes, it was art, architecture, and history. Louis Bourgeois, she had an international breakthrough after age of 70. And she has been working particularly with traumatic experiences. She's well known for figures like very, very huge spiders that she called Maman. And she died in 2010, just before she would have been 99 years old. And sadly, before Steilnes Memorial was opened. Peter Zumthor, he is a Swiss architect, and he got the Pritzker Architecture Prize in 2009. He came to Vardø in 2007 to see the site, the gallows, Steilneset, and the landscape. And he noticed the construction of old fish drying racks that he could see, and also small lights in the windows of the houses in Vardø. And he has drawn both the buildings, the glass pavilion and the long building. Here you can see the island of Vardø. That is the same as øy, it means island in Norwegian, and you see this island from a distance. I went to meet Peter Zumthor in Switzerland in 2008 when I started to write the text for commemoration. And he had built a small model, and I saw the length of this house. It was very long and very impressive. And we discussed the text exhibition that should be located inside the long building. And we agreed that the historical documents should be the fundament, but that the text should be shorter, and also that the individual victim should be in focus. Not only a number in a row, but each of them an individual person. So here are the two buildings in the summer of 2011, when it was opened. And Queen Sonja of Norway opened the memorial on the 23rd of June in 2011. So from the left, you see Jerry Gorway came from Louis Bourgeois Atelier in New York, Queen Sonja, and then it is me, and it is Peter Zumthor, the architect. So my work was to write the panels, this text exhibition. And I took the outset in historical correctness. I want to show the extent of persecution And it was a very strong demand I had that each individual should have a name. And I would like to have time and place of the trial and the development of the trial, the verdict and sentence, which is till ill or ball, means to fire and fire at the stake. This is what you see at the end of the court records. And I wanted to give each individual person a voice. So I used the confessions to catch the voice of each person. For me, the work was most important to carry out in a way that I showed respect and dignity to the victims. This was very important because I know that when it comes to witchcraft trials, many other approaches can be taken. Here is the original court records of Elisabeth Nilsdatter from 1621. And here is the panel inside this long building at Stelnes. So I had the historical facts at the top to the right, and then the name, and then the development of the trial. And then this long part at the bottom is from the confessions, her voice. And then at the end, it is the sentence to death in fire at the stake, till ill or ball. The panels in this room commemorates the 91 victims. And it's a long and narrow corridor, and the visitor has to pass all the 91 panels. In Norwegian, we say, å gå en rettergang. It means that you go a walk, passing something that is very difficult and hard. This room is only for the 91 victims, nothing else. So there is one small window for each victim where you can see out glimpses of the heaven, sea, and the ground. And there is one small bulb for each victim. Here is inside this long building. And once you set your foot inside this building, you feel almost like you have come to another world. It's very quiet and it's a very special atmosphere. The architecture is a change of space and condition you experience. And the architect Beate Hölmebakk, she says, passing through the steel door, one enters blackness. The art installation is called The Damned, the Possessed, and the Beloved. It's a chair with 5 flames and 7 mirrors above. Bourgeois has made a confessional chair for a chapel in France with an inscription over resurrection, reparation, redemption, restoration, reconciliation. And I think you can see some of this also at Stelnes. Here are the chair with 5 flames, it's burning always. You can go into Stelnes Memorial day and night, it's always open. Louis Bourgeois have said, I have faith in the symbolic action. And the symbolic action is the opposite of the literal action. Meg Harris Williams had pronounced these words. There are mirrors over the chair, and the mirrors looking down on the conflagration are the eyes of the voyeurs. But if we catch our own reflection, we can see Medusa within. So the visitor, when inside the glass pavilion, walk around the chair, and also in the mirrors above, you can see yourself reflected in when you are walking around this chair, because the mirrors have a bit different angle towards the chair. So my first visit to Stelnes was the day before the opening on the 22nd of June in 2011. And I knew all the text, but when I came in there, it was a very strong experience because there is no buffer. You walk immediately in the meeting with name and individual faiths. And we see that these victims, they have lived their lives in Finnmark and met their death at Stelnes. So you are touched when you come into this place. And this is also what the visitors tell me. Many of them have contacted me afterwards to say they are touched, or in Norwegian, berørt. I've been working to create a teaching package, one school day for pupils around 14 years old to come to Stelnes Memorial. And we created an interdisciplinary group with a curator, a drama pedagogue, art pedagogue, and a philosophical conversation pedagogue, and me as historian, and then one curator from national tourist routes. And when the pupils come there, they go one and one through this long building. And when they have also been in the glass pavilion and seen the art installation, they get a small piece of paper and a pencil, and then they write down 3 words about their own experience at Stelnes. And these 3 words they use to write a small poem. And when they come home to the school, they write the poem together with the teacher. And they have written many good poems with insight and showing that also so young people have insight in life. Stelnes Memorial is more than history. The contents of Stelnes Memorial show mechanisms which connect to parallel assaults today. It could be the use of pressure and torture to press forward confessions, but it could also be violence against women. That is a global problem. And the Stelnes Memorial, it creates a link to this problem. Seen in such a context, Stelnes Memorial becomes a reminder and a warning about injustice and violence that we shall not tolerate. And me, as a historian, I'm very pleased to see and to understand that Stelnes Memorial also has this symbolic effect that it could be tied to very problematic happenings throughout the world today. So at last, I will try to show you one of the small poems that is 14-year-old pupils have written, and I will read it first in Norwegian and afterwards translate it. Det var stille der. Hun ble dømt til dødens bål, men var uskyldig. It was quiet there. She was sentenced to death in fire at the stake, but was innocent. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Lee, for that very, very interesting presentation. And I'm very struck about how you gave us the history, in particular in Finmark, and then related that to the memorial, showing how we came from several centuries ago and how this can still be relevant to people today. It's a very interesting memorial. Does anyone else have questions? We can open it up now for questions.
I do.
Okay, Lori.
Hi, first of all, thank you so much. I'm just in awe of your dedication and your passion for this subject. And I bought your book with all the transcripts, and I mean, for me, I've only been able to read it in small snippets because of the powerful you know, like you said, the testimonies and things. It's just, it's too much. It like cuts to your core when you read it.
Mm.
And a few things that I was kind of touched with, well, one thing, the commonalities, that some of the commonalities that we see in the witch trials in Europe and in Salem, for instance, the use of children testifying, like in the Pendle cases in Britain and in Salem. Is that something, I know that the young girls were acquitted, that were charged with witchcraft, but did they use children in those trials for as witnesses, or is that something that was common?
No, in Finnmark, these 6 small girls, in fact, they confessed that they have learned witchcraft from their mother or from their aunt, and the local court, the indictment in the local court was that they were guilty. But luckily, these trials were passed on to the Court of Appeal judge. And when we are at the second half of the 17th century, at this time, new ideas started to enter the fields of law, and the Court of Appeal judge, he never mentioned anything about guilt. They were acquitted immediately. But child witnesses are much used in Sweden in some trials called the Blåkulla trials. These trials happened in the 1660s and 1670s, and a lot of children were interrogated, and they told that they were brought to a place called Blåkulla. It is like a witch's hill or a witch's mountain, and they denounced people they allegedly had seen in Blåkulla. So they were used, child witnesses were used, I would say, comprehensively during these trials in Sweden. And no doubt the court believed what the child witnesses testified.
I was interested in technology because there is a case in Ireland where a woman was condemned to death because she had a treadle on her spinning wheel. And this would have been in the late 1500s when it was introduced. I think I'm a spinner, so Leonardo da Vinci was one of the people to develop this shuttle that flew around. When you did treadle, it would put it on the bobbin. And in the past, you walked your big wheel, and you could do about 20 miles a day. So this woman showed up with this new technology, and they didn't understand why she's sitting, and all of a sudden this yarn is being formed in front of her. I wonder if there are any cases like that where something was introduced and people just didn't understand what is this woman doing or this man is doing. In any cases of that where technology is introduced?
I would say that the similarity that comes to my mind when you mention this is this abundance of like stealing milk, and the abundance of milk that is caused by witches. And I've seen in the Spanish Netherlands, it is used about a woman who is giving milk to her small baby. She gives so much milk that it causes suspicion. But I've not in Norway come across this technological development used as an argument for witchcraft to have been performed. Not in Norway, no.
I have a question about the witnesses from the community that might have been swearing that they saw saw this person performing witchcraft or flying or something. Looking at the testimony, did you find that there were, this is the theory I have, that the same people were the troublemakers, they were the ones who were anxious to get out there and accuse people, or was it coming from all over? Could you tell from the testimony, the transcripts?
I would say that when it comes to performance of traditional harmful witchcraft, maleficium, I often see in the records that if there is a person that is troublesome, that is using strong words, that is threatening, and a person that is so-called difficult in the local community, the witnesses testify about what she has been doing, and that this is something unnatural about the effect of what she is doing. When it comes to this new and learned ideas about witchcraft, these demonological ideas, you have first a person who has been suspected for witchcraft, the first one to confess, to be imprisoned and confess. But when these trials start, they are just rolling along because you get so many new names, and they tell about the other people they have met at the witches' meetings, so that the fact that you have seen a person at a witches' meeting, that is enough to have her taken into the courtroom and tried and interrogated and tortured. And these trials, they are in a way escalating due to their own content about these witches' meetings and this pact with the devil.
One other real quick question. In the book, The Mercies, if I remember correctly, the reading circle will help me if I don't. It seems that one of the motivations for the governor to crack down so hard was because of not only fear of God and fear of the devil, but fear of Russia moving, the political situation with Russia being so close to the border and sort of, power struggles. Do you know anything about that?
What we see often in witchcraft panics, I would say, particularly witchcraft panics, when they are exploding, you often find that this is a time where there is unrest, or there are diseases, or often you see that it is a community with the stress on the community. And in Finnmark, there were not so much trouble with the Russians, but in this time, in the 17th century, the lines, those who were fighting against each other, that was Denmark, Norway fighting against Sweden. You had the 30 Years' War in the 17th century, so that certainly this question of war is an actual question, and that when a society experiences that there is a very strong pressure on the local society, then it is easier that you see a witchcraft panic flaring up.
Thank you. Thanks.
Do we have an indication from the courts of who is considered a child versus a woman?
at the time, usually the 6 small girls that were accused in Finnmark, we know the age of 2 of them. One is 12 years and the other is 8. So this one 12 years old, she is considered to be a child in Finnmark.
I was intrigued by your graph of the lines drawn around the circle to different persons' names. Did they like grab somebody and then they, in order to save themselves, try to at least just point their fingers at other people?
Yes, this was what I was interested to find out, because often we think as human beings, we think that when you are denouncing another person, it is a kind of revenge that a person you do not like. But when I look at this, I think, in fact, when I look at these names and the way all these denunciations happened, I think it seems to me that they were picking names that they knew from the village. I think they were so, in a way, exhausted and very tired, so that I think this idea, or what we naturally will think, that no, they are pointing to all those other women that they do not like. I think it was more like blind denunciation, that they took names they knew from their village and they denounced this, said that this and this and this person had also participated in a witches' meeting. So I have not found anything in the material that should confirm this idea that they were particularly after somebody they did not like. But I found this several places that if there was a woman, these maids traveling up to Finnmark from further south of the coast of Norway, they came to a society where they had no network. And if there had been a woman there helping them the first time or period of time they stayed in the village, I've seen a couple of examples that they want to keep this woman out from accusations. So I think these young girls that came traveling up to Finnmark to seek work at this time, they were vulnerable, and both those who came new into the society and those who lived there, I think they were exposed to a very, very harsh period of time due to this persecution. And I personally think that all women were vulnerable because they were women.
Another similarity that I saw was, and I was kind of surprised when you said that only 68% of the women, or that 68% of the women that were killed in Finnmark were married. Because one thing I saw, for instance, my daughter-in-law's ancestor was Susanna Martin from Salem, and she was killed there. But similarly to Anna Pettersdotter, how she was accused. Both of these women were accused at one point when their husbands were alive, and then it was thrown out. And when their husbands died, they were accused again and they were killed. Is that something that you see repeated throughout?
I've seen some cases where the husband has tried to get the wife free, to get her acquitted, or tried to get her out on bail. I've seen some of these cases, but like in Bergen, the famous trial of Anne Pedersdatter in Bergen, who was taken, imprisoned again after her husband died. I've not seen in similar in Finnmark, but I would think she was more vulnerable when her husband, who had a high position in Bergen, was not there anymore.
You mentioned the girls that were young girls that were acquitted by the magistrate. Do you have other examples of people that were acquitted, and what was the mechanism that allowed them to be acquitted?
Yes, from this, the last panic, the same I referred to, giving examples from the 10th and 11th of March in 1663. After this panic was in a way the last cramp of a witchcraft panic in Finnmark. And there are 2 women accused during this panic that miraculously got the trial passed on to the Court of Appeal judge, the same that acquitted the 6 small girls. And these 2 women, I think they might have got their trials passed on because they had small babies. They had small children themselves. And when they managed to get the case passed on to the Court of Appeal judged, they were lucky to be acquitted. But really, this is an astonishment, because they were accused and they were already sentenced by the local court, but miraculously, they managed to get their cases sent up to the Court of Appeal judge. And he came to Finnmark the same summer, the summer of 1663. So they were lucky with the timing of his coming.
Were the accusers typically men or not?
I would say those who accused other people of witchcraft could be women or it could be men. But within the judiciary, all people in the courtroom were men. All the bailiff and the under bailiff and the magistrate and the district governor, they were all men. But when you look at who has accused this person of witchcraft, it could be a man or it could be a woman. And in the witchcraft panics, since they are not really accused of witchcraft, but they are accused of participating at the witches' gathering, most of those who are denounced by women.
It smells an awful lot like Hollywood nasty high school popularity contest stuff that, you know, it just like nothing ever changes.
There was an interesting,
Much deeper level. I mean, the outcome is much more severe on this.
Oh, of course.
But
But people don't change.
yeah,
Mm.
another quick question with the geography. You know, Finnmark is thought to be the dark, the unknown, you know, to most people in Norway, and the same thing in Pendle in England, where, you know, that was kind of the lawless area. Is there, in Europe, was that a common theme where the majority of these witch trials and things would take place in places that were, you know, on the outskirts or on the fringes of the societies?
Yes, Finnmark was thought to be to the north and therefore maybe inhabited more by evil people and evil forces. But there is one factor that I think is very important for these places where you had this escalation of trials in Finnmark and the Pendle witches and in Essex in England. And this is the personal factor. You have it in Åland in Sweden, and you have it in Germany and Denmark. So you see, when a person with authority within the court enters into office, and if this person has in his head very, very strong fanatical ideas about witchcraft and the idea that he is going to persecute witches, then you often see that there is a flare-up of trials just afterwards this person has come into power. So I think the personal factor is very important. Like in Finnmark, the first witchcraft panic in 1620-21 happened after a Scotsman was installed as district governor in 1619. And also the other two panics are happening after very fanatical men with authority within the court have been installed in their positions. So I think in the 17th century, when you have this mentality and these ideas about witchcraft and the danger of the devil's allied force, one person within the court can really act in a very severe way because he is able to put authority behind his ideas. And I mean, that is just the same you see today when you have this combination of fanatical thoughts and a person with authority to carry out these thoughts in death sentences or severe judgment, then you have a very serious situation. So I think this type of mechanism that we see related to the personal factor and the ideas inside the head of a person with authority within the judiciary, I think you have many similar situations today. And this is one of the points I think witchcraft trials really can illuminate some of the problematic happenings we see in the world around us.
You know, there's a very interesting case, also 1690 in Newburyport, Massachusetts, where my ancestor lived. And it actually was a dispute over two pastors. I think the church in that town split, but one of the pastors, the people believed, the congregation believed like the Presbyterians, that we are the church and we hire the minister. But the other group would believe that the pastor was the one who was in charge. And so I think the one who had the more liberal view, they accused the wife of being a witch, and she was condemned to death. I don't have the exact date. My cousin found it because it turns out one of my ancestors was on the committee that was deciding this woman's fate. And it's kind of shocking, but she was commuted by the governor of Massachusetts colony, but she was not allowed to leave her house. She could only go, I think, 600 feet from her house her entire life, but she was commuted, but that was her sentence. And I don't have the date, but it's right there in the 1690s. And it's personal. It's a personal fight between two groups that, you know, they have a certain way. Well, our church should be this way and it should be that way. And then you accuse the wife of one of the pastors. Very
Mm.
curious.
Yes.
Professor Williamson, is there such a thing as witchery?
Pardon?
Is there such a thing as a witchery? Were there people dancing around fires and things? Ever? In your research in Finmark?
Could you repeat the question?
Is there any reality at all to witchery? Were there people who were practicing witch stuff?
In my view, no. I think the confessions were stories. They had heard stories, but I think the mentality in these 3 centuries that we have witchcraft persecution, I think the mentality and the ideas and the spread of these ideas to all layers of the population, the spread of ideas so that it came into the minds of people. I think this is what they are retelling in court, and all these clearly unrealistic elements that we see in the confessions, like shape-shifting and night flights and turning into animals and birds and whales. I think these are elements in this narrative of witchcraft, and I think they are retelling it when pressed and tortured. So this is my view.
So it's just all made up stories, because we have witches modern day here who folks in a coven who practice whatever it is they practice.
I think that in the 17th century, it was an atmosphere and a climate that brought these people to the courtrooms, and where you had, due to the influence of these ideas in the laws and also in the church, you got very unfortunate fates of the accused persons. So I do not believe that there are witches in the sense that their confessions could mean. They are, I think they are telling narratives and telling confessions, but they are in a way drawn into this these ideas and this fear of the evil and of the devil that is very hard for us today to understand, because we are today all children of the Enlightenment, and we are thinking in case of what is possible could have happened. So I think in a way it is for us today, it is a bit difficult to understand what happened in the villages and in the courtrooms in the 17th century, because I think the fear we see was real. There was a real fear, but we are today thinking in a very different way. We are asking whether it is possible that this could have happened. And you see this change when you see in the records the change that from the middle of the 17th century, in 1650, when a woman confessed to have performed this witchcraft and had these meetings where the devil took place, they believe it and they sentence according to it. In 1750, 100 years later, they do not believe it. They say it was not possible. They are not interested anymore. The court are not interested in witchcraft anymore, because they think in a different way. So this is and this is what struck me as very, very interesting, that in the course of 3-4 decades, they stopped belief all over Europe in witchcraft. From 1700 and on to 1750. It's over. We do not believe in this anymore. What this woman is saying cannot be true. So this change in what they believe in has struck me as very, very interesting, I would say, because it shows how quickly can, in this case, the whole of Europe stop to believe in something that has been so fatal for so many persons. But they do. They stop to believe in it, and then it is over.
I wonder if it's changed that much. As you say, it stopped within fairly short time. But it's not, I don't find it so strange. I'm just writing a book about the medieval age in Northern Europe. And when you see it today, I'm struck, as I think Alan mentioned, how many similarities you see today, though. And it's not so strange to me that people in 1600s, where you really didn't know about phenomena. I mean, the Northern Light, of course, was, now we know what it is, but back then they just saw this thing happening on the sky. I mean, when you see what's happening today, and I probably would have said a little bit different before the pandemic, but I mean, today it's just amazing what you see people believe in. We have a bunch of people sitting waiting for JFK to come back to Dallas, and they were spending 2 weeks there. And this is today, you would think that, with all the information, how can you get to a number of people sitting there waiting for JFK to come back? I mean, it's just beyond. I mean, even if he hadn't been killed, he would have been too old by today to be around. So so I must say my personal thing is, yes, we advanced far in some areas, but in other areas, I think, as Alan said earlier, it's amazing how many similarities there are, and how many, surprisingly many people, even today, are ready to jump on this fear.
Yes, but yes, I understand what you are saying, but I think still the difference is that during these 3 centuries, 1450 to 1750, people were brought into courtrooms and sentenced to death because they were alleged to perform witchcraft. I think that is the difference, yes.
I agree, because that's one of the areas of our legal system today is infinitely better than it was back then. But humans haven't progressed as far, I think, maybe, unfortunately, in some areas.
Yes.
One of the, sorry, Bill.
Yeah,
One of the
okay.
things that seemed
ahead.
unfortunate was the women who voluntarily submitted themselves to the water ordeal, for example. It made me think that perhaps there was a profound ignorance involved where, maybe she had one too many beers and wasn't really sure what happened last night, and now she's thinking maybe she's possessed, and something you can't explain, and to ease her own conscience, well, maybe I'm now a witch. Maybe you should throw me in the river and let's see what happens. An impressionable, insecure person, susceptible people are always in society. And I wonder, kind of, again, today as well, by the way, but back then, they were easily taken up on their challenge.
Yeah, this person, Dorette Pølsdatter, who was killed on the rack. It is, from what you see, she is saying in the courtroom, it's almost like she's she's searching her memory, she's searching her mind if she could have got something evil in her through a bit of bread or fish or a drink or something. So she's trying to go through everything she has experienced and eaten, and if she became unwell after having had a meal. So, but still she refuses to confess to witchcraft, and this is the problem and the reason why she is killed then. But I think at this time in the 17th century, in the minds of people, I think they, yes, like Dorette Paulsdatter, that they are going through every stone of their experiences to see whether or not they could have received something that was unfortunate. So certainly people could be afraid that they had got something in the food or anything like that. But like Dorette, if they refused to confess to witchcraft, they could not be sentenced.
I was wondering, one of the, if a person was good in medical arts, if a woman was good in healing or herbs and so on, might she be considered a witch? And could this have had the fear of being accused of a witch be something that would inhibit people from practicing healing or helping other people with medical problems?
Yes, it was for some years from in Norway from 1584 and until 1617. It was a very strict sentence for not only for healing, but also for those who came to a person and wanted to be healed. So this was a practice that they did not like. However, in 1617, this very harsh sentence, it was before 1617, in fact, death sentence for practicing healing, but afterwards it was banishment or fines. That was the sentence for healing. And when you see the material on a bigger scale, like looking at the material from all of the northern part of Europe, I would say that those who are practicing healing, they are among those accused, but they are not in majority, and they do not receive the strictest sentences. But they are there, so that healing also, at least for a period of time, was considered also to be an unwanted practice, and not least if healing went wrong. If a person who was supposed to come to a healer did not get any better, then it was often you got accusations for maleficium, this harmful witchcraft.
Well, Liv, I'm now looking at the clock and it's getting late, and of course it's even later for you in Norway. And it's almost 11 o'clock there at night.
Christine, could you repeat this?
Yes, I said I'm looking at the clock and I realize it's getting very late in Norway.
Yes.
I think maybe we should wrap things up. I think we've had a lot of very interesting questions. Your talk has certainly, inspired lots of questions. It's a very,
Yes.
very interesting topic. So I want to thank you very, very much for coming and giving your presentation and giving us a lot of information about the witch trials. And I know you're continuing your research, and you have another book coming out soon, and we'll look forward to seeing that.
Will it be in English?
Yes, it will be in English. And I would also like to thank the audience for all the good questions, and Christine for the introduction, and Bill for helping out with this shared PowerPoint. And so I would like to wish all of you also a very good Christmas coming up, and greetings from Norway.